Now that you have learnt about the various shooting modes, Mr. Desikan Krishnan will show us the camera display and tell us how we can select the various shooting modes with the help of the camera display.
We will now have a look at the display on your camera screens when we set the various shooting modes. The first one will be S, or the shutter priority mode. In Canon cameras, it will be AV. I have now set the shutter at 1/60th of a second. I have set the shutter speed at 1/60th of a second. The camera has chosen an aperture of f13. The camera has chosen an aperture of f13 for 100 ISO. This is the display or the information which you will get on your screen. Now I am going to move my shutter speed. Now watch what happens to the aperture. I move from 1/60 to 1/125. I move from 1/60 to 1/125, which is one stop faster. So I am cutting out light one stop to the shutter speed, and see what happens to my aperture. It has now opened up to f9. It has now opened up to f9. From f13, it has now opened up to f9. ISO remains the same. Now let us see when I am going to move again. I am going to move from 1/125 to 1/250th. My shutter speed, I have moved from 1/125 to 1/250th, which is again one stop faster than 1/125. The aperture now I get is 5.6. The camera has automatically changed my aperture to 5.6. Then now let us go to the aperture priority mode. We are now in the aperture priority mode. Canon cameras will have it as AV. I have set the aperture at f8. I have set the aperture at f8 and I get an shutter speed of 1/60th. I get a shutter speed of 1/60th. My ISO is 100. Now I am going to move my aperture. Now I am going to move my aperture from f8 to f11, which means I am cutting out light by one stop. So my shutter speed has come down. My shutter speed has come down to 1/80th. It is all done in the camera. Now you have to control only the aperture. You have to choose only the aperture which you want to shoot at, and the camera will automatically adjust the shutter speed for it. Now I am going to cut down my aperture. Now I am going to cut down to f16. So when I cut down to f16, what happens to my shutter speed? You see now it has come down to 1/40th. It has automatically come down to 1/40th. So in the aperture priority mode, you choose whatever aperture you want to shoot at, and the camera will automatically select the right shutter speed for it. So that is the aperture priority mode, or the AV. Now we are going to have a look at the M setting, or the manual mode, and we will study or learn how to set your camera exposure meter. Now I have set the camera ISO at 100, and I have chosen a shutter speed of 1/60th and f16, which shows me the right exposure. This is the exposure meter inside your camera. 0 indicates the right exposure. All this indicates the plus sign. Towards the plus sign indicates overexposure, 1 stop, 2 stops and 3 stops. Minus indicates underexposure, same 1 stop, 2 stops and 3 stops. Now 1/60 and f16 gives me almost the right exposure. Just one this thing away, but that is okay. Slight underexposure, I told you, may be better for saturation. So 1/60 f16 gives me the right exposure. Now let us check what happens when I change my shutter speed. I move on to 1/30th. You see these here, you have a look at the exposure meter. Have a look at the exposure meter. It shows an overexposure because I have not changed the aperture. I kept the same aperture, but I have moved it. Here there is nothing automatic because we are in the manual mode. Earlier in the shutter priority and the aperture priority mode, if I either adjust the shutter speed, the aperture will change, or if I adjust my aperture, the shutter speed would change. Here you will have to manually change both. So when I move down my shutter speed to 1/30th, If I keep it at the same f16, you will get an overexposure. Have a look at the meter. It is indicating overexposure by one stop. Now, I move to 1 by 125. 1 by 60th f16 was the right exposure. So, 1 by 125th is giving me an underexposure. I have to correct this. I will have to move this or open up my aperture to f11 to get the right exposure again. So, in the manual mode, you have to set both the aperture and the shutter speed, whereas in the shutter priority or aperture priority, you have only to set one, the other the camera will take care, but in the manual mode, you got to take care of both. We now move on to the program mode. The only input which you have to give the camera is the ISO. I have set the camera at 100 ISO and it indicates 200 at f7.1, that is a shutter speed of 1 by 200 at 7.1. I can change the combination within the same exposure value. 1 by 68 gives me f13. So, in the program mode within the same value, you can change. If you do not like the setting, you can change the setting. The only input which you have to give is the 100 ISO. Now, within the program mode, there are various programs. If you see this symbol of a flower, it is for close up, it is for macro photography. You can go very close to the subject to shoot. Then you have what is known as a portrait. So, this is, if you see a sign like this, it is in the portrait mode where it would give you a mid reading. You will not get great depth of field, nor will you get a fully open aperture. You will get somewhere in the middle. Then you go to the landscape mode where it will be more on depth of field. You will get a smaller aperture, it will be more on depth of field. And then there is a sports mode where you will get a faster shutter speed. The camera will set at the faster shutter speed, and the ISO also will, in all these modes, the ISO will adjust by itself. So, you at the sports mode, it has gone to 1 by 400. At the landscape mode, it's at 1 by 400. At the portrait mode, it has set itself as 1 by 200, and at the close-up mode, it's at 280 ISO. Now, here is the portrait mode, here is the landscape mode, and here is the sports mode. Now, there is an auto mode. In auto mode, you can't make any changes. Whatever the camera has chosen, that is what you have to shoot at. There is absolutely no way you could change, whereas you saw in the program mode that if you didn't like this setting, you could go to another setting within the same exposure value, but in the auto mode, everything remains the same. So, that by far is all your shooting modes, and you can choose whatever mode you are comfortable with. As I told you earlier, you do not have to shoot at the program mode or the auto mode unless it is an emergency. You stick to either the shutter priority or the aperture priority mode. You do not even have to bother around with the manual mode, so that you can concentrate on the subject, on your composition. You just put your camera on aperture priority or shutter priority, go ahead, concentrate on your composition, concentrate on your image, go ahead and shoot.
We hope that now the shooting modes are absolutely clear to you, and also how the camera display can be used to select the various shooting modes. As you continue to experiment, your confidence will grow on which mode to use in which situation.